So now I'm honored to move into the next segment of the session and honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Corey Owens. Corey is head of global public policy at Uber, or Uber Technologies, as you all know, a software platform that connects consumers with transportation options in more than 300 cities and 57 countries around the world. And Uber Technologies is a new member of the ITS America Leadership Circle, and we're happy to have them on board. Prior to joining Uber, Corey managed global public policy at Facebook, focusing on intellectual property, payments, taxation, and telecommunications policy matters. He previously held public policy and communications roles at the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union and the American Civil Liberties Union. Corey's a graduate of Truman State University and the George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. So please welcome Corey Owens to the podium.
Thank you very much, Jill, for the kind words of introduction. Thank you all for having me here today. Before we get started, can I just get a quick show of hands? How many of you were able to take an Uber from the airport on your way here? All right. For those of you who haven't tried it yet, it's the last thing you must try in Pittsburgh right after the sandwich. I should start by noting that I am at heart and by origin a Missouri boy. I didn't move to a big city until 5 years ago, and those of you from New York will forgive me for even pretending that Washington, D.C. is a big city. So for old time's sake, if we can get the slides up, we'll step back to 2010. Well, we will in just a second. As my colleague from Montreal would say, voila. So step back with me, if you will, for just a moment, 5 years ago to 2010. I had just moved to Washington, D.C., and in particular, I had moved to a part of the city that would ultimately serve as a rude introduction to urban mobility, or in this case, the lack thereof. In Northeast D.C., there was no nearby metro, and taxis wouldn't pick you up for love or money. Bus service was regular during the workday, but spotty at night and on the weekends, which unfortunately is the exact same time of the week that beer is most tasty. Around the United States, consumers were making much the same choice that I was, putting cars in their driveway to the tune of 240 million cars on America's streets. The iPhone 4 and the Google Nexus 1 came out in 2010, technological marvels the likes of which couldn't have been imagined just a few years prior. Even so, smartphone penetration in the United States was barely 25%, primarily a tool of a moneyed few. In Houston, Secretary Ray LaHood keynoted ITS America, and he lamented the lack of investment in service transport, but he also called attention to the job creation promise of our sector. Just down the way in New York City, the V and the W lines took their final laps, and in San Francisco, a startup called UberCab launched in June of 2010, connecting somebody in need of a ride to somebody willing to give one. Now come back to 2015. I still live in a wannabe big city, but otherwise, much has changed. We've all spent the last 5 years wondering, have we actually hit peak car? But if we have, it's hard to tell. And even if we have, only just. This year, we'll put another 17 million cars on American streets. Several generations of technology later, and at 75% penetration, nearly every American is carrying a supercomputer in their pocket. Today's iPhone has literally 100,000 times more transistors than the Apollo mission that put humans on the moon. The future, my friends, is now. This year, a company that has no cars, no drivers, no riders, no physical infrastructure, just a very large cloud and an even bigger idea, opened ITS with a riveting keynote about adorable robots. The times, they are a-changin'. The Second Avenue subway line is scheduled to open this year, and that little startup called Uber now operates in more than 310 cities in 58 countries. Apparently, we added a country since Jill and I last spoke. Don't tell anybody, but of course, the city of Steel is my personal favorite. In those 5 years, 2.4 billion kilometers of Uber trips have been completed, approximately enough for a round trip from Pittsburgh to Saturn. But please note, should you choose to take this trip, surge pricing may apply. The world has changed a lot in the intervening 5 years, and in the midst of the ups and the downs, we have made a lot of progress. But I think it can safely be described as necessary but insufficient. Generations of academics, activists, policymakers, and industry leaders, many of them the people in this room here today, have worked tirelessly to change our reliance on single-occupancy vehicles. But widespread carpooling remains an elusive goal. The problem is getting worse faster than the solutions are finding adoption. Capital-intensive projects like light rail and metro are falling prey to tightening municipal, state, and federal budgets. In my own DC, the Silver Line is finally under construction, but over budget and behind schedule. And the promise of the Purple Line is completely up in the air, with officials from multiple jurisdictions uncertain about who pays for what. But even relatively simple and affordable projects suffer. San Antonio's B-Cycle program arrived to much-deserved fanfare on Texas streets, but its future is now uncertain, without a corporate sponsor able to make up the gap in city funding and insufficient ridership for sustainable economics. Meanwhile, the problem gets worse. We spend more of our time in traffic. We have a harder time getting where we need to go. A recent study by TomTom shows increases in congestion across the United States, with our major urban areas paralyzed by cars for more than a quarter of the day, adding, for example, in Los Angeles, an hour and a half each direction. On face, the ideas that we may have passed peak car and are suffering from historic levels of congestion are difficult to hold in the mind at the same time. But the number of cars, at the end of the day, is less important than where and how we are using them. At the turn of the previous century in 1900, just 1 in 7 people worldwide lived in cities. Today, it's 1 in 2. By 2050, another 2.5 billion people will have moved into or been born into urban areas, making city dwellers 2/3 of our planet's population. The number of vehicle kilometers traveled globally is projected to have increased by 233% by 2050, and 54 trillion new trips. 54 trillion trips, in addition to what's happening today, will happen between now and 2050. Managing cars is indeed, in the understated analysis of the OECD, the crux of the transport conundrum faced by municipal authorities worldwide. And it is very difficult to disagree with a statement that includes both crux and conundrum. The world's largest cities are already gridlocked for much of the day. For example, in Mexico City, residents spend 20 million hours commuting every single day, resulting in a productivity loss equivalent to 2.5 million working people just disappearing. The city's congested roads cost it 5% of the whole country's GDP. And that story is much the same on every continent. From Rio to Manila, from Paris to Beijing, from Delhi to Istanbul. It is truly Carmageddon if we don't do something meaningfully to change our collective direction. But this is not a phenomenon limited to far-off megacities. This is a problem coming to a theater near you. Ask any big city mayor in the United States what direction they think this is headed. Ask her about the correlation between congestion and environmental and public health challenges. And big city, in this case, is actually small enough to capture little old DC and even littler Kansas City. A full quarter of my hometown is congested during evening peak. A cow town so packed with cars that the cows don't know what to do anymore. Meanwhile, researchers are increasingly able to substantiate what many of us have suspected for a long time. Lack of access to transport is directly linked to income inequality and social immobility. Even the most aggressive view of up by your bootstraps can acknowledge the need to get from your home to the bootstraps and back again. Fixing Wall Street is one thing. Making Main Street easy enough for us to get around, it turns out, is quite another. Given the overwhelming body of evidence that we are on an unsustainable road, why are we still on it? In short, personal cars are mobility insurance. Hundreds of millions of Americans are making the same choice that I did when I moved to DC. It is better to have the known than risk the unknown. We have failed to interrupt our own inertia. Across the country, in red states and in blue, in rich communities and in working ones, owning a car is all but non-negotiable. So much so that having a second or even a third car still makes intuitive sense to many people. I grew up in a 2-car household, and that never struck me as strange until recently. A fact made all the more staggering by how little each of these cars is used. In no other part of our lives do we tolerate paying tens of thousands of dollars for an asset that will sit idle 95% of the time. If I threw away 95% of what was in my fridge and paid for 95% more square footage than I actually ever set foot in, I would quickly be hungry, divorced, and broke. What about the personal car so defies common sense so powerfully that otherwise intelligent and rational human beings behave like hoarders? Simply put, Because the alternatives don't compete with personal car ownership. To be fair, many of the alternatives were never designed to compete with the private car. They were largely conceived of as either supplements or substitutes for those who couldn't afford a car. And to be fair, more mass transit options have to be part of the solution, and individual alternatives don't have to compete on all counts. But cumulatively, we suddenly find ourselves looking around in desperate need of robust alternatives for huge swaths of our population, including those without ready or convenient access to traditional alternatives. And so we look around and we find ourselves somewhat unsurprised that so many people still pay a huge amount of money to use an asset just enough that they congest our city streets. Alternatives have to compete with personal car ownership on more than inherent goodness. They have to compete on reliability, on availability, and on affordability. Not because they should have to, but simply because they do have to. After decades of experimentation, capital investment, and public education, we must confront hard truths. If we want people to give up their cars, no, if we need people to give up their cars, we cannot rely on them doing so simply because it's the right thing to do. The rising cost of gas hasn't been enough to dissuade most Americans, and demographic shifts will take more time than we can afford. We will need additional and better solutions, and we will need them soon. On this, today, Uber's 5-year anniversary, it is instructive to recall our early operations. Here we see the first time that 10 Uber trips were happening simultaneously. 10! It was an amazing moment. It was monumental achievement for this all but unheard of app. But nobody was thinking about not buying a new car because of this. Now, 5 years later, the picture looks very different. There isn't a single day that passes without Uber rides covering every inch of every street in Manhattan. A complete map of that city is created every 24 hours. And while the map is pretty, it's not nearly as interesting as the behavior it reveals. People are using something other than their personal vehicles. Mass transit ridership is up in New York City, and New York City taxis are as busy as they've ever been in the parts of the city they actually serve. So where did all of these people come from? It's not yet fair to say that millions of New Yorkers are giving up their personal cars, but it is now unequivocally true that they are making different choices than they used to, specifically choices that involve much more highly utilized assets. And why are they doing this? Because the alternative now competes with the mobility insurance represented by ownership of a personal car. The new option is cheaper, it is faster, and it is just as available. We spoke earlier of the increasing threat of density on our streets, the density of single occupancy vehicles that create congestion. But not all density is created equal. Quite to the contrary, density is a requirement if we want to find a better way. Not a density of vehicles necessarily, but a density of choices and a dense utilization of those choices. From a density of choice follows all of the things. Density of choice makes alternatives to personal car ownership as fast or faster than owning your own car. In Washington, D.C., it took me at least 3 minutes to find the keys, walk out to the driveway, start the car, and get on the road, or exactly the same amount of time that it now takes for an Uber to get to you throughout Washington, D.C. Critical density means that a ride is never more than a few minutes away. The positive flywheel of density is seen in every one of the 300 cities in which we operate. As more density is achieved, arrival times go down, which is nice for the end consumer on a one-off basis. But it is absolutely essential to convincing people that they don't need the mobility insurance of a personal car anymore. Why would I let the thing sit in my driveway if the other thing comes to me in 3 minutes? The effect on affordability is much the same. By making better choices available to more riders in more places, prices can drop to levels affordable on a day-to-day basis, while reaching the same earning levels for drivers. The ancillary benefits of density as alternatives to car ownership are somehow simultaneously both surprising and obvious. One of the biggest is service levels in historically underserved neighborhoods. It is important when looking at this map to understand Uber does not direct drivers where to station. They make their own choices. As density is achieved in the historically well-served urban core, drivers from outlying neighborhoods find that demand exists in their neighborhoods too. And as density increases more, it becomes clear to consumers that an alternative to personal car ownership is possible everywhere in their city, further increasing demand and further spinning this flywheel. In cities where comparison data is available, the results are night and day. In one Boston neighborhood with only a single T-stop, service levels by taxi were at 65%, whereas Uber, without directing drivers to station in the neighborhood, achieved 99%. In many neighborhoods, like my own in Washington, D.C., where mass transit, taxi, and walking aren't feasible options, only 99% reliability will be enough to convince people that personal car ownership is no longer necessary. But even in areas with extensive mass transit, a density of options is essential. At a time when every municipality is scrounging to find money for upkeep, let alone expansion, double-digit percentages of our urban populations suffer from a last-mile problem. Absent a density of choices at the end of the line, personal car ownership will remain the more appealing option for many, if not most people. Extending capital-intensive transit with capital-free, flexible solutions makes the idea of taking metro much more palatable to many more consumers. And the palatability of alternatives to personal car ownership is especially important when we think about the snap decisions that people make at their, we'll describe it as least rational. A quick story for you about how I came to work at Uber. As you now know, I lived in DC, part of it that wasn't terribly accessible. You also have now gathered that I like good beer. This is a pretty bad combination. Enjoying a glass or four and then not having a good way to get home isn't the right answer. At some point, the easy, if very irresponsible answer was to drive to the bar and promise myself that I would only have one. And at some point in this cycle of good intentions and broken promises, a friend introduced me to Uber. And suddenly, beer and responsibility weren't at odds anymore, which is the long way of saying I, like thousands of other Americans, only needed better choices in order to make smarter ones. Research done with Mothers Against Drunk Drivers in California showed that a density of better choices has in that state already prevented nearly 2,000 alcohol-related crashes. Similar research in Seattle found a 10% reduction in DUI arrests after Uber's arrival in that market. And smarter choices, plural, by definition include more than one mode. Multimodal, Regina and I were just discussing, is a phrase that must have been used 1,000 times at this meeting, but it is also the key ingredient to the positive flywheel that gets people to leave their cars at home. From Ubers with bike racks in Seattle and Portland, to streetcars, to BRT, to better sidewalks, to bike share, to Zipcar, to Lyft, to Get Around, all of these make it incrementally easier for people to leave their cars at home, which in turn is a rising tide that lifts all boats. If bike share or sidecar make it even fractionally more likely that a consumer feels comfortable leaving their personal vehicle at home, then cities win, as do the traditional mass transit modes that now become part of a larger, more robust offering. And for the people in this room, as does every company that does business as an alternative to personal car ownership. A density of choices need not be something we do out of the goodness of our heart. It is genuinely a rising tide that can lift all of us. It is worth noting at this point that all of the things we've discussed today assume high but sequential utilization, which is to say the more highly leveraged use of a vehicle's time, if not the vehicle's space. Simultaneous utilization, the better use of a vehicle's space in addition to its time, completely changes the game. The OECD recently ran a simulation on a mid-sized European city and found that simultaneous utilization could reduce the number of cars on the road by 90% and completely eliminate the need for roadside parking. Such results are so significant that they sound vaguely utopian, but in fact they are among the only sustainable paths forward. Better utilization of a vehicle's time or of its space is a half measure. Poor utilization of both, as we have seen too many times in too many of our cities, is a recipe for urban paralysis. Such gains, of course, cannot be achieved overnight. Intermediary steps are needed, and mobility as a service solutions like Uber Pool, which intelligently matches multiple riders headed in the same direction with the same driver, according to an analysis by MIT's Sensible City Lab, can reduce cumulative trip kilometers by 40% or more. And as intermediary steps go, 40% ain't nothing to sneeze at. But even Uber Pool requires a density of choice. Carpooling is hardly a new idea, but adoption has been low. Is it because people feel weird sitting in the same car? Maybe, though I would contend that that's a solvable problem, and quickly. I think the much bigger problem is that carpooling almost always takes you out of your way, by definition. To compete with personal car ownership, that out-of-your-way time has to be trivial. If I'm on my way to a meeting and picking somebody else up requires a 10-minute detour, it's just not happening. If, on the other hand, the detour is 90 seconds, I won't have looked up from playing Scrabble on my phone in time to notice. Density of choice remains the essential ingredient. But of course, this is easier said than done. I've only been working in this field for a couple of years, and so many of you will know this much better than I. There are things we can change and things we can't. We have made decisions that brought us here, or others did 80 years ago and we inherited them. And the baggage they bring is often daunting. They involve entrenched operators, baffling local politics, and tightening budgets. And those are often reason enough to ignore the little things and to focus only on the big wins. Spending a decade planning the DC streetcar or evaluating the optimal BRT route. And we should work on the big wins. Lord knows we are going to need them. But the perfect can no longer be the enemy of the good. If the alternatives to personal car ownership need to compete on reliability, availability, and affordability, they need to do so today. Why don't they? Because we won't let them. Because we have the serenity to acknowledge that some things are simply too expensive or complex, but too often we lack the courage to change the problems right in front of us. For example, in many markets around the world, the law requires for-hire vehicles to return to their garage of origin before picking up another passenger. Laws on the books that by design mean utilization is at best 50%, the antithesis of a density of choice. In Miami, the law imposes a $90 minimum fare on any for-hire option that's not a taxi and limits the number of taxis in that city to a mere fraction of comparably sized metro areas, though you would never know it by looking at the airport parking lot. And in Philadelphia, police on horseback have cited drivers for offering the same sequential utilization that all of the research tells us is key to critical density, which in turn is the thing needed to convince people to leave their cars at home. The horses, by the way, are really what make this picture. Perhaps the most baffling of the prohibitions around the country are those on carpooling for anything more than cost recuperation. Even though we know that simultaneous utilization is the holy grail of congestion relief, our laws still assert that people should only carpool out of the goodness of their heart, or apparently because there are good jokes in the car, eliminating any incentive for most drivers to do so, even where there is zero cost to the city. Policy solutions that are totally free to cities are available today. They are not silver bullets, but they do tear down the barriers we have created to a critical density of choice. And perhaps as importantly, they cost cities nothing. That they have the potential to create tens of thousands of jobs, just as Secretary LaHood reminded this very group 5 years ago, is gravy. Very recently, our millionth driver took his first trip on the Uber platform. Cities and states around the country have taken the first steps towards allowing, if still not encouraging, a critical density of mobility choices. The slow boring of hard boards continues, but that can't be enough. We also have to invent the future. Uber recently announced a partnership between us and leading scientists at Carnegie Mellon University in the form of our Advanced Technology Center right here in the heart of Pittsburgh. The decision to locate the ATC in Pittsburgh was an easy one. The best and brightest minds in the field are already here, and by keeping them here, we set Pittsburgh up to be one of the great mobility technology hubs in the world. We will be researching mapping, vehicle safety, and autonomous cars, research that will help further our goal of making vehicles smarter and safer, all while increasing the density of choice in our cities. It will also, apparently, provide much new fodder for takers of grainy conspiracy photographs in Pittsburgh. Whether industry or government-led, affecting the kind of change America needs will take bold leadership. I got a phone call earlier this morning from the Secretary of the Missouri Department of Transportation, somewhat unexpectedly. I wasn't planning on talking about it here today, but he told me that they are later today announcing that 200 miles of the I-70 corridor will be opened as a test bed for innovation. This is an interstate. This is the most legacy, built-up infrastructure we have. And we now have leaders that are going to say, we can't do it all ourselves, and the perfect can't be the enemy of the good, and we need better solutions now. That is exactly the kind of leadership that we are going to need to avoid the future that awaits us without change. And I, for one, am incredibly excited by Regina Hopper joining ITS's leadership team. It is more important now than ever that this organization have strong, visionary leadership sufficient for the challenges and the opportunities in front of us, because they are not insignificant. We should also recognize and thank Mayor Bill Peduto, both for hosting ITS in this amazing city, but also for welcoming forward-looking research like that which is happening at the Advanced Technology Center. Having ITS in Pittsburgh this year was a very special treat for us, and hopefully is an omen of better things to come. I thank you again very much for having me. I now realize I stand between you and a very exciting panel on partnerships, which includes our own Dr. John Bears from the Advanced Technology Center. Thank you all very much. I'm excited to talk with all of you, and I'm excited for an exciting year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey, for those